Looks pretty nice, doesn't it? Thing about it, and I would say this is probably true of just about every creche, every nativity scene that I have ever seen. It's totally inaccurate. We have gotten used to seeing the scene like this. And yet this has been so cleaned up, so sanitized over the centuries. We have to remember, this is art. But it's not a picture. It's not a representation of the way that things actually were. It was a barn with lots of animals in it. Smelly, stinky animals. Yes, it was a roof over their heads, but it was a barn. There was a young mother who gave birth to her first child. I don't know how many of you who are moms, after you gave birth to your child, 10 or 15 minutes later, you were all perfectly cleaned up and ready to look at your child like this. See, sometimes it's important that we keep in mind the reality of these people that this event happened to. And this is usually the worst one of all. This is not the way that shepherds looked back then. We're used to, little shepherd boys. We're used to little drummer boys. The shepherds of that time were some of the crudest, the roughest, the dirtiest people you could imagine. They had no difficulty, for the most part, stealing from others. They were, by our standards, thugs, criminals. And yet, it was to these that God sent the first news. So, we have, I think, a particular sense, pictures in our minds of how the first Christmas was. And that's fine. I'm not saying that you should change, anything. But sometimes I think the difficulty can be is because that's our image of Christmas, that we can be limited and picture Christ coming in only that way. This is maybe a good year for us to remember that God has given us the gift of His Son. Not just us who are here in church, us nice, respectable people, but everyone. Especially those that maybe we wouldn't think of as being, quote unquote, worthy of Christ's coming. Those that maybe we just assume God wouldn't worry about. But it's not true for all people, all God's children. And so I found this reflection from a woman named Valerie Schultz. And as we go into this, you'll understand what her role is. But I offer this to you just as a way for us to look at Christmas a little bit differently this year. And remembering God has many, many children in many situations, in many settings. It was mid-December, the air chilled and hopeful. Advent was more than half over. We'd already celebrated St. Nicholas and Our Lady of Guadalupe, so the big December event was really almost here. It was almost Christmas. My youngest daughter was at home putting the stamps on our stacks of almost late Christmas cards, some of which had to travel to the other coast and beyond. My older daughters would be arriving home soon with stylish haircuts and mysterious gifts and tales of the big cities in which they now lived. Our tree was decorated. Our outside lights blazed into each dark night. I had a shopping list waiting in my car for a last-minute trip to the grocery store to replenish the ingredients for the final batch of Christmas cookies. Pounds of flour and brown sugar, a dozen more eggs, bags of walnuts and dried cranberries and chocolate chips, a bottle of peppermint extract. Before all that, though, I had something to do. A communion service at the state prison where I was a volunteer with the Catholic chaplain. I was not allowed to bring food into the prison, or I would have brought some of the holiday treats that one customarily brings to the homes of friends at Christmas time. Homemade cookies, or eggnog, or even candy canes. I brought in only a prayer book and my volunteer badge, a stripped-down version of the things I usually carried. All the stuff that I brought everywhere, my wallet and phone and purse, stayed in the car. The state was very strict about what came in and just as strict about what went out. I brought in good intentions. I brought out fresh faith. In the chapel, on the medium security yard that morning, before our service started, 3 inmates were unpacking and setting up a Christmas tree. As they fitted the parts together, I saw that the tree was short, spindly, anemic, unloved. It had a Charlie Brown quality, even though it was artificial. The men took ornaments from a box, strung a metallic garland through the tree's branches, and affixed a star with a picture of an angel on it atop the highest point, which would have been shorter than they were had it not been on the top of a table. They worked assiduously with a minimum of conversation, placing their decorations and then leaning back to judge the exact positioning. They handled the shiny balls and ribbons tenderly, those hands that had somehow violated the law. The men wore matching blue shirts and pants that said prisoner in unmistakable block letters down one leg. They had very little to call their own. They occupied one of the lowest rungs of society's ladder, and perhaps deservedly so. Yet their delicate care as they trimmed the prison tree, as they moved on to arrange the figures of the shepherds and animals and new parents in the creche, moved me to brief tears. These particular inmates were changed and humbled men. They had done wrong, but they had also worked to make some form of restitution. They were collectively in the hands of God. Their faith stigmatized them in the eyes of other prisoners on the yard. Within the manger scene, they placed and moved and placed again the lit-up angel, the sanitized shepherds, the animals that didn't smell, the parents who were not afraid, all awaiting a baby whose breath was destiny. Their holy task completed, the three men slapped each other on the back. They knew that the beautifully wrapped packages under the tree were empty and were not for them. Yet they had positioned them artistically, reverently, as though to please unseen children. They honored, in this blessed place of opposites, the spirit of Christmas, the poverty of the first Christmas, with their very lives, in a way that we on the outside possibly do not. It occurred to me that maybe we cannot understand what it means to stand stripped naked before God, to have nothing left to offer but a willingness to try again. We may not comprehend exactly how forgiving God really is. As usual, after the service, the inmates thanked me profusely for coming in. And as usual, I felt undeserving of the thanks. They had, as usual, taught me well today. Their grace in dismal circumstances made me realize that I got too caught up in the cookies and the cards. I didn't have the time for silence and salvation. It was almost Christmas, and as I headed to the grocery store, still feeling the pressure of those hearty handshakes on my hand, I prayed for simplicity. I prayed to be able to mind the things that matter and to put aside the things that didn't. I prayed to remember, amid my own family festivities and Christmas cheer, the empty packages under that spindly tree and the faces of those who yearned for and who believed in rebirth. Wherever you are, whoever you are, a Savior has been born for us. A Son has been given to us. To all of God's children. Merry Christmas.